Welcome to the TrustBridge Capital monthly video series entitled Asking for a Friend. I'm your host, Eric Jefferson, and this month we're going to focus on the U.S. consumer. 2 weeks out from the election, and surprisingly, markets have remained fairly calm given the uncertainty that lies ahead. A lot of that has to do with the encouraging overall macro environment, which at the end of the day is driven by the U.S. consumer. So I want to take a couple minutes, go through and discuss what are those features, what are those aspects impacting the U.S. consumer today. Now, before we get started, have a few words from our legal team. With that, we can go ahead and begin. And as we do, want to highlight the importance of the U.S. consumer and their impact on the domestic economy. At the end of the day, U.S. consumer contributes to roughly 70% of overall spending. So not surprisingly, if the U.S. consumer is doing well, if they are continuing to spend, that in turn provides a fairly natural tailwind for continued economic growth. So what are those factors impacting consumers? Well, first and foremost, on the left-hand side of the page, you can see unemployment still remains low, below long-term averages. Granted, over the last 6 months, we have seen a slight uptick. Granted, that is less about mass layoffs rather than more new workers entering the workforce relative to the number of new jobs being created. At the end of the day, number one metric or indicator of continued consumer spending as if they are gainfully employed today. Related to that, most workers have received real wage growth or raises. Again, inflation obviously still remains elevated, but in this case, we've actually seen wages on an inflation-adjusted basis not only keep up, but in many ways exceed what those higher price levels have been. That obviously not only creates more confidence, but truly at the end of the day, more dollars in a consumer's pocket to be able to go out and spend. Lastly, we have the wealth effect there. That simply refers to the appreciation in stock and bond portfolios, real estate assets. The higher value those are, in turn, that is more money in a consumer's pocket that directly correlates to both the ability but also willingness of consumers to go out and spend. On the flip side of the equation, we certainly have seen savings rates come down relative to what have been some peaks following COVID. Again, a lot of stimulus money during a time when people couldn't go out and travel, have experiences. As the economy has reopened, we have seen those savings rates come down. That tends to disproportionately affect more of those middle and lower income consumers. As a result, have seen a greater usage or reliance on credit, and not surprisingly, have seen a subsequent uptick in defaults, things like auto loans and credit cards. Again, not yet to the level where that is overly concerning. Something though, if that trend were to continue, we would certainly evaluate in our overall process. So the one aspect in all of this that arguably gives me the highest degree of confidence in continued consumer spending is when we look at the breakdown of spending by income bracket. So here we have some data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and that yellow slice of the pie, that represents the percentage of consumer spending attributed to the highest 20% of earners. And the green slice at the bottom, that is the segment attributed to the next 20. So the way to interpret this graph, you can see the highest 40% of earners account for roughly 2/3 of the overall or total spending. The average consumer lives in that orange bucket. Again, you can see they only contribute about 20% of overall spending. You then have the lowest 40% of earners in the pink and blue, adding roughly another 20%. Now, there are absolutely some very real challenges facing the middle and lower end consumers today. We think about the elevated costs of food and shelter, but the overall impact on spending behavior, particularly for that lower segment, they tend to spend most, if not all, of what comes in a given month. They're not making any adjustments or altering spending based upon their perception of the overall economy. On the other side of that equation, the top 40% of earners in the US, those are the ones that disproportionately tend to own much more in the way of stocks and bonds and real estate. That again has enjoyed some very meaningful double-digit gains over the last couple of years. That ultimately, again, we think about the strength of the average consumer, but more importantly, the strength of the higher end consumer relative to the amount of overall spending that they do. That is the one aspect in all of this. It does give some confidence that regardless of what may happen in that macro environment ahead, we'll still see the U.S. consumer show up and do their part to keep the economy moving forward. So that's all for this month. I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us and encourage you to submit questions for future segments. Thanks again.